great. Welcome to the historic livery here in beautiful downtown Goderich. My name is Rob Bundy, and you know, around here, we have a lot of history. We have a lot of stories. And every one of those stories is a delicate stitch in the rich tapestry that is our county. And we wouldn't have those stitches if we didn't have guys like David Yates. David Yates, former teacher, author, local historian. And it's amazing. We wouldn't have these stories without Mr. Yates. I hope you don't mind me calling you Mr. Yates. I know teachers have their first name surgically removed after a certain point in time, so you have to do that. Got some more folks coming in. Come on in, folks. Find yourself a place. David has done an amazing job over the years of collecting the really cool stories that we would never hear about. He goes through all the research, does all that kind of the archives and stuff. I don't know how he does it. Every week in the paper, there's another story about some amazing thing that's happened around here that nobody knows about. We only know it because of David Yates. And David's written a lot of books. You got some here? Got some at the back? Yeah, excellent. And I'm sure you'll be able to sign those for the good folks. David's going to do a little chat here, and then if you have any questions afterwards, he'll be happy to entertain those. So just put your hand up, and I'll run over with the mic so that we can get you on tape up there. All right, without further ado, David Yates.
Well, thank you, everyone. And it's good to see such a good crowd. Thank you for sharing a hot, sunny afternoon with me in here in the livery. And before I start, I just got to say about Rob, I think Rob was my first editor in 2006 or 7 when I first started writing those stories in the paper, and he was very encouraging, very nice. And so I thank Rob for allowing me room in your newspaper when you were the editor. Thank you. Anyway, well, my talk today is going to be on kind of like some of the odd shapes and sizes and corners of Huron County, known as the Gothic Era, the Neo-Gothic Era. Huron County in the 19th century was a place where people tended to work really hard. They got on with their neighbors. They did the right thing when they had to do it. And it makes for incredibly boring writing about it. We're more interested in the oddities, the curios and the oddities of our history. And that's why I decided to put together some stories in Gothic Huron. And Gothicism refers to the age, it was a revival from the Middle Ages. In the 19th century, people became fascinated again with the Middle Ages. They thought it was an ideal time to live, if you can imagine. And the Gothic architecture, where you had these distorted angles, shapes, doorways were far larger than they had to be or elongated. They came to points, and the beautiful stained glass windows gave people a otherworldly sense of themselves. And that was what the Gothic era was supposed to be in art and architecture. In society, it became a time where you get, the Victorian Age the Gothic Age was a time of tremendous social, political, economic change. And you get these stories where people are fascinated with great acts of daring do, and at the other extreme, incredible acts of depravity. It's the age of heroes and the age of Jack the Ripper. Both stories, or both ends of the spectrum, fascinated people. And before we begin, just to say this is, well, does anyone recognize where that gargoyle is on the corner? It's from a church in Huron County. There's a hint. Well, it comes from Trivet Memorial Church in Exeter. The gargoyle was a classic detail on old Gothic architecture. The one at Trivet isn't like a water spout, like with the open mouth. The gargoyle was a demon that used to protect the outside of churches or ward away evil from the outside of churches. But carved in relief at Trivet Anglican Church in Exeter on the side of the walls is this beautiful motif of gargoyles, typical of the Gothic age. And Trivet Memorial Church is an ideal, it's an example of high Victorian Gothicism in Ontario. I won't talk a lot about architecture. I'm going to talk about some of the other bits. And more Gothic, there's the spire of St. Paul's in Clinton. Again, gateway to, or entrance to Trivet. But the backdrop to the Gothic era was this Victorian fascination with death. It was the cult of the dead is literally what some people refer to the era as. It sort of began with the death of Prince Albert, and Queen Victoria went into deep mourning on the death of her husband, Prince Albert. Some of you probably heard the stories where she had his shaving kit laid out outside his room beside his bed every morning until the day she passed away. And the funeral for Prince Albert and how he was memorialized, it set the tone or the pattern for the Gothic or Victorian age. Women in Huron County or anywhere in English Canada after the death of a close relative, they went into deep mourning by donning black crepe paper. They wore black hats, black dresses. That went on for about a year, and then after a year, you went into, deep mourning, or it was a lesser thing where you're allowed to wear gray and various shades of gray. Men tended to wear black hats or black armbands for a year, and that was considered acceptable mourning for people in the Gothic age, in the Victorian age. The other death is the assassination of President Lincoln in 1865. His funeral cortege, his funeral train back to back to Illinois, was this huge 10-day spectacle. It was almost like it was almost like a coronation for a great king, as people at the time expressed it. But between those two high-profile deaths, it really triggered something in the Victorian age. And if you go to our own museum, one of the most beautiful artifacts to the museum is this hearse. You go into the funeral parlor part of it's on the streetscape in our Huron County Museum. It's a beautiful object, hand-carved ivory, gilt mountings, hand-etched. It's a beautiful thing, but when you take a step back, you realize it was designed for a horrible purpose. The Victorians were fascinated by death. When Grandma was dying, the family gathered around the bed. When somebody died in the house, all the clocks stopped, black cloth went over the mirrors, and you get, for the first time, this respectable person known as a funeral director, a funeral conductor, and you have a funeral home. But most people in the Victorian or Gothic age tended to bury people out of their homes. And the funeral conductor and the funeral director you sent for to advise you on how best to run a proper funeral. You had to send out black bordered invitations. It sometimes took almost 2 weeks from the time that somebody was deceased to the time that they were buried before you were able to bury them out of the house. But in that day and age, you had to send things like telegraphs or black bordered invitations, letting relatives on the other side of Toronto perhaps knowing that somebody that they might know was deceased. And so you had to make all these arrangements. Flowers had to be brought to the house largely to keep down the odor of decomposition. But if you look at that, one of the things that kind of helped with that, if you look at that artifact on the right-hand side, it's a portable table. The funeral director would have brought that with them to the home. What do you think that portable table's for? What? Somebody said it? Yeah, it's a portable embalming table. There's a metal ring where you'd slip the deceased foot through, and then came on an angle so that you could embalm in somebody's living room the deceased. Okay, the Victorians were fascinated by death and preserving the body for 10 days to 2 weeks to have a funeral in the house. You might have seen the museum, I think, has taken them off display, but they used to want to have a memento of the deceased, and it wasn't uncommon for heads to be shaved and hair to be carved in the hair wreaths, and you display those hair wreaths over the fireplace or on the wall of your home, and people understood that. The other thing that's very popular is post-mortem photography. Our celebrated photographer Brophy, Salos, made a lot of post-mortem photographs of people who had been deceased, and people would keep them because, remember, in that day and age, there's no other way of keeping mementos from the deceased, so they took pictures, which to us might seem really morbid and creepy, but in the Victorian age, it was a way that they could hang on to something from a deceased child or a deceased parent or spouse or something like that. So they were fascinated with death, and they were fascinated with death-defying stunts. People who could brave the odds and survive or not survive were heroic figures. And this leads us to, and here's one of those people, Harry Leslie. Probably never heard of Harry Leslie, but in his time, he was very famous. He called himself the American Blondin. He was a daredevil. He was only the third person to tightrope walk across Niagara Falls, the Niagara Gorge. He was a celebrated hero in his day, and he decided to come here to Goderich shortly after he made this tightrope walk to repeat that performance. And so he strung a high wire across the Maitland Valley over here. I'm not sure where, but it was enough on the banks where that drew crowds of thousands of people came to see Harry Leslie just weeks after he tightrope walked across Niagara Falls to walk across the Maitland Valley. He did. He performed the stunt beautifully, and the papers all roared, and people talk about his manliness and his calmness under fire, that sort of grace under fire. And he must have really liked the reviews because he thought he'd try the stunt again, not too much, just a little later in Bayfield. So he did, and he drew a huge crowd to Bayfield. He was going to walk somewhere across the Bayfield River, and on the appointed day where he was going to make his walk, unfortunately it was raining. And so he wisely chose not to make the tightrope walk across the river. He deemed it too dangerous. Well, you can imagine what a crowd of thrill seekers thought of that. Okay? All of a sudden, the manly daredevil is kind of like the cowardly huckster sort of thing. So when he went back to the hotel room at the River Hotel, which is still it's an apartment building at the top of Long Harbor Road in Bayfield, he was met by guys at gunpoint that told him he was going to go back out there and make that walk. He had a tussle with them, jumped on a horse, and he was chased out of Huron County. He later wrote, he was chased out of horseback by men brandishing pistols, firing at him, and that's how he left Huron County. Once again, somebody we haven't heard of, but the Victorians would have been fascinated by his ability to defy death, but on the other hand, they turned on him just as quick when it seemed like he was taking on the role of the coward. Harry Leslie met with an unfortunate end. You'd have to be crazy to tightrope walk across Niagara Falls, and he might have been, because it seems about 10 or 15 years later he committed suicide. He jumped off of a building, or whether he fell, it remains to be determined, but he didn't meet with a happy ending. Okay, and the other thing with the Gothic age is this eeriness, these eerie coincidences. Goderich is a lakeport town. We're connected with the lake. Our history is connected with our marine history. And there is the story in the 19th century of the Black Cat schooner, the Explorer. It became an unlucky explorer. It was Captain James Waddell, was from Chatham, brought his schooner up here to Goderich, and he engaged in the supply run from Goderich. He'd run supplies to the lumber mills and copper mines up at Bruce Mines and all along the up and down the Bruce Peninsula. He made a pretty good living at it, and he had a weird story to tell. In November 1867, he was alone, and he was frantically rowing towards, I think it was Wyerton? Yeah, Wyerton. And he beached his craft at Wyerton, which was also a fishing village, a marine village at the time. And he had this terrible tale to tell. He said, a terrible storm came up. That's plausible. It's November. We get some of our worst gales here. We had a terrible storm came up, and he was distraught because his ship and crew were lost. And it was plausible, but in subsequent summers, people had mysteriously seen him and his 15-year-old son teenage son, out. It looked like at the spot where he claimed that the schooner went down, and it looked like they were kind of diving for stuff. But there was nothing conclusive. There was nothing you could read in that, and of course it's November. But people, right from the beginning, had an unusual suspicion about his story, that he was the only one that survived from his schooner, the captain. In 1870, unfortunately, Captain Waddell and his teenage son drowned when their barge went down in a storm in November off of Amberley. His headstone you can see on the left there is in the Maitland Cemetery, and everyone pretty much forgot about that story until an American diver found the wreck of the Explorer on the bottom of the lake floor just off of the Bruce Peninsula. And when he investigated, he found a couple very interesting things. He said the ballast, the hold, had looked like deliberately been emptied and filled with rocks. And all the shuttlecocks, the stopcocks, had been pulled, and it looked like however the ship sank, it was scuttled by its captain and crew. But the more disturbing discovery was he went further into the cabin, and he saw the remains of 4 crewmen. The entire crew of the Explorer had been locked in from the outside. It was the speculation when they brought the boat back up and towed it into Goderich. The speculation was that Captain Lawson drugged or got his crew drunk, locked them in the hold, took off some of the cargo and sank the ship, and then in subsequent summers came and pulled off the cargo and payroll and the other valuables from the ship. It's the only explanation at the time that made sense. They raised the Explorer, brought it back into town. Judge Ira Lewis, whose son would become a member of Parliament, and Ira was a mayor of Goderich for a while, he raised the ship, purchased it at salvage values, and put it on the same run again, doing the same thing. When lo and behold, the ship in, I got to catch my year, 1883, the ship was off of Southampton, ran into a terrible, terrible gale, terrible storm. The ship made for the port of Southampton, which at the time was it's got lots of shoals. And if you know Port Southampton today, if you try to sail in, it's hard navigating. The skipper ran the schooner accidentally aground off of Southampton, and the ship began to break up. And despite attempts from the shore, the seas were so heavy and the water was so rough that nobody could get out to her. And they could see the last crewman as the ship was breaking up and the mast was slowly sinking into the water. The last crewman dropped and drowned. And all aboard, all 6 crewmen, 5 or 6 crewmen aboard, perished. Okay? Became known as the Black Cat Schooner Explorer, that nobody talked about or wanted to talk about. In fact, Ira, the owner, said, let's not mention anything about this ever again. Okay. Good advice, probably. Okay. Now, during the Victorian Age, as I said, we were fascinated by death. And one of the things that fascinated people then was watching other people die, be executed. The hangman the hangman came to Goderich 3 times. For William Mahone in 1866, Nicholas Mulady in 1869. the Milady hanging, we like to think of as the last public hanging in Canada. It probably wasn't. It's the last public hanging before legislation came about that said that execution should be held within the walls of some, but there's all kinds of evidence that there is public hangings. Okay, people in the Victorian Age for the first time are fascinated. They like reading about crime, true crime stories in the paper. Crime was now something that happened to other people in the Victorian Age. The Victorians, it wasn't nearly as violent getting around England as it was, say, 100 or 200 years later. So now you could read about murder as something that happens to other people. The hangman visited Goderich 3 times. And in Canada, unlike the United States, we had one Dominion hangman. In the U.S., the local sheriff was empowered by law to carry out executions, mostly by hanging. Canada was always by hanging. In Canada, after we had a Dominion hangman, okay, we know his name now, but at the time, the hangman was given, when he traveled, the assumed name either Mr. Ellis or Mr. English. He was given a gentleman's income. That's very important. He was given a stipend of $1,200 a year, which would have been, as I said, a gentleman's income. The Dominion hangman that came here for Edward Jardine lived in the best neighborhood in Toronto, although his neighbors were scarcely aware that he was the Dominion hangman. They thought he was a traveling man or traveling salesman. And, excuse me, he received about $50 to $75, depending on how far he had to travel, to hang somebody. And he also got to claim expenses, and he was able to keep the personal effects of the person that he had executed. The hangman that came here in 1911, pardon me, sorry. I'd have given my students hell in class if that had happened, but anyway. When he came in 1911 for the execution or the hanging of Edward Jardine, Edward Jardine had raped and murdered his sister-in-law in 1910. Over here, he picked her up at she was a scullery maid at the Colburn Hotel. He picked her up at the Fall Fair in September. We used to hold over at what was called Ag Park. It's now Bannister Park. And we're right about where Robertson School is, Goderich Public School. There is an old farmhouse where they found the remains of poor Lizzie Anderson. Jardine was almost immediately a suspect, rounded up, and he even kind of confessed to the murder in the jail. And at 21, he was sentenced to be hanged by the neck until he was dead over here at the old Goderich Courthouse. On the day that he was to be executed in June, throngs, even though it wasn't a public hanging, throngs gathered around the jail. People were paying a nickel and a quarter to get an attic view from I think, what's that? Is that Anglesey Street over there? The houses that looked into the jail yard, people were paying money, if you can imagine, paying money to get up in the attic and look in the window to see if they can get a glimpse of the scaffolding. When the hangman did his job, and he claimed he got the job, he applied for it. Several dozen people applied for it. He was an Englishman. He had said scientifically studied hangings. There is 2 ways when they hang somebody. They hang by strangulation, and that was the long, nasty death, and he didn't like that. He thought he'd hang people humane ways by putting the rope at the right spot, hooking it up right, so that when the body dropped, it would snap the neck and basically kill the person semi-instantly. He didn't always get it right. When Edward Jardine was hanged, it took him 30 seconds to walk, according to the paper's account. It took him 30 seconds to walk from his cell to the time the trap door opened. Should also mention the hangman also knew that he'd be the last face on earth that the condemned man saw, so he always tried to see the condemned man before, and he also had an ulterior motive. He'd ask them to stand and walk towards him, and have a conversation. But what he's really doing is registering in his mind how tall he is, how much he weighs, because he had a body to weight ratio, which told him how long to cut the rope, so that when the body dropped, the neck would snap. If it was cut too long, the body might be beheaded, which is an awful mess, and if it wasn't cut long enough, he might have a long and painful death. We're not sure what happened, but it took 30 seconds from the time he left the cell to the time that the trap door opened. It took him another 7.5 minutes to die. Okay, and his mother, who was waiting right out, she wasn't allowed to witness the execution. She was waiting right outside the door. She claimed the body, but the hangman claimed his clothes. And he also took the rope, because the hangman had to bring his own rope. He took the rope and he cut it up in pieces and either gave it or sold it to people who wanted a grizzly souvenir. We used to have one of those grizzly souvenirs hanging in the jail until I guess somebody complained. And the other thing that was kind of unseemly, they took everything, including somebody grabbed the half-eaten toast that he had that morning. So it was an unseemly act, but people were fascinated by the hangman's arrival, and they'd read about the hangman in every single paper that everywhere he visited. He got national coverage, although most people didn't know his identity. The guy that hanged Edward Jardine, he was a secretary treasurer of the Toronto Rowing Club, which at that time was a really prestigious position, and it showed his status in society as a man of respect and a gentleman. And then one day he was introduced to a retired inspector of the Northwest Mounted Police, and the inspector drew his hand away and says, "I know you." And of course the hangman said, "No, I don't think you do." And he refused. The Northwest Mounted Police inspector refused to shake his hand. If his neighbors knew that he was the hangman, you were eschewed or shunned from polite society. He couldn't become a Rotarian, a Mason, an Odd Fellow. His wife and their children wouldn't be received in the nicer homes in the area, and that's exactly what happened. He had to move. When they found out his identity, he had to change neighborhoods, sold neighborhoods, and actually died in the 30s in an alcoholic fit, which is kind of a sad ending. But he always claimed that he was the sword of justice, doing his work as humanely as he could. Now, was he a good guy or a bad guy? Would you have the hangman and his family in your house? Have them over for dinner? Okay, so we've talked about, now here we have some more daring do. The wreck of the schooner Malta. In November 1882, Captain Buckley of the Malta, he was making the last run of the season from Port Huron, and he ran into a blinding snowstorm, heavy waves, heavy seas, and gale force winds. His little vessel was battered back. In fact, it was battered back so far that he thought he mistook the lights of what was a St. Andrew's Day dance going on at Barker Hall in Bayfield for the lights of Goderich. And so he made for what he thought was Goderich using Goderich charts, and he ran his boat, his schooner, on a shoal just off what's now Delavan Street in Bayfield, just south of Pioneer Park. Fortunately for him, somebody saw his craft run aground. They ran into Barker Hall because at that time Bayfield was a fishing village. It was a St. Andrew's Day dance for the local Orangemen, and the fishermen there were almost all Orangemen. And somebody burst in saying there's a schooner wrecked off of the shore here. They ran out, and the fishermen were able to run a line out. They tied it around the tree in Pioneer Park, ran it out to the schooner, and they were able to rescue the entire crew of 9 men, 1 woman, and a parrot. Right? That act of daring do earned them a lot of praise in the nationwide papers. And right up until, well, recently, you could still see the wreck of the Malta off of Delavan Street in Bayfield. If you go there on a clear day like today, if you walk out far enough, like I'm going to guess only about 40 or 50 feet, you'll see the ribs of the Malta. You see on the bottom right picture there, the bathhouse was built from the superstructure of the Malta, and they took the wreckage off and turned it into a bathing house, and it stood there for generations. And there's the Malta in the foreground. And today it's celebrated. If you go to Pioneer Park in Bayfield, some people wonder that great big stick sticking out of the ground. Well, that's the keel of the Malta and an effigy of the parrot that they... It's funny, you could save 100 people, but you save one animal or bird, and that's what everyone remembers. Anyway, okay. Little bit of daring do. And in the Gothic or Victorian Age, temperance, the temperance unions were extremely strong in rural Ontario. And for good reason, okay? People were drinking on, well, at one time you'd brag about your drinking prowess. Tiger Dunlop, okay, drank his whiskey almost by the gallon. In fact, if you've ever been to the museum, they roll out his trolley with the 12 disciples, 12-gallon-sized jugs, and they'd all be filled with whiskey for the night's merriment. One jug was always filled with water, which they'd named Judas. But they used to brag about how much that they could drink. But all of a sudden, you get the changes in the Industrial Revolution. And if you're a farmer and you're behind the plow and you've been drinking whiskey all day, which is what people did because the water's unsafe to drink, the worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to plow crooked burrows. I mean, if you're driving, you ever heard the saying, fell off the wagon? If you're driving your buckboard and wagon home and you're incredibly inebriated, okay, a lot of them would just crawl in the back of the buckboard and the horse would run them back into the barn. You might freeze to death, but you weren't really a threat to your neighbors. The Industrial Age changes that. Men disappear into the factories and the offices. They're paid in cash. And when they go home, instead of bringing the paycheck home, they stopped at the local saloon and drank it away. And women, in particular, became incredibly incensed and were the first to become aware of the problems with heavy drinking. And they organized politically, because they couldn't vote, remember? So they organized movements or organizations. One of them, and the most powerful one, which still exists today, is the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And they didn't want people to stop drinking altogether. They wanted to temper or moderate their drinking. Because there's evidence, and there were, like, people would drink, like a gallon of whiskey or rum a day. Colicky babies were given rum. Kids would take home there's no drinking age. Kids would take home for the dinner on the way home from school. They'd stop at any brew pub, which were almost dotted every corner in every town. They'd take a 5-gallon pail of beer home for the family to drink it for dinner. So drinking, everyone drank, but for the first time, when you're drinking around heavy machinery in the factory, when you're drinking around like your John Deere tractor or something, all of a sudden, you being drunk with alcohol, it becomes a problem. You used to hear about these horrible farming accidents, and especially then all these drinking accidents. And the Women's Christian Temperance movement became really, really powerful. Even though they couldn't vote, they exercised a lot of authority at the ballot box. And one of their best tactics was to bring in a speaker. And this guy in this area, you probably heard of Billy Sunday and Carrie Hatchett. Billy Sunday was a pro ball player in the 20th century, and he became a temperance advocate. They've done movies on him. Carrie Hatchett, she'd walk into a saloon with her hatchet and start slashing it up or bashing it up, daring gentlemen to come and forcibly remove her. Of course, they wouldn't, because they were supposed to be gentlemen, right? They're not supposed to touch a woman. But this guy, Joe Hess, he was in that league except about a generation earlier. Joe Hess, his autobiography is really, really, even today, gripping reading. He said when he was born, they think he doesn't, his parents were German immigrants, but he thinks he was actually born in Buffalo or around Buffalo. And he grew up hard. He said he grew up, he doesn't know anyone who was born with as much strength as he was born. And he became used by local gangs of thugs to go and collect money and thump people. Then he became a heavy drinker. Then he became a boxer. And if you want to read a really, really good account of bare-knuckle, no-holds-barred boxing, just read his autobiography, because he talks about just getting pounded in the face, and his face wells up, and he can hardly see 3 days after a fight, but when you win, you win, and if you lose, you're a bum. Anyway, he was a sinner who'd seen the light. He abandoned drink and his old ways and became a really, really powerful temperance speaker, and he came here several times. He really liked this area, and he even convinced J.J. Wright of the Point Farm Hotel, which used to be a luxury hotel where he used to stay, to make this a dry or temperance hotel. And J.J. Wright saw the light and said, after hearing your testimony, Mr. Hess, from now on, the Point Farm is going to be a dry hotel. You won't be able to buy liquor here. Well, that might have been true, but just outside was the Crown and Anchor Hotel, just outside the gates of the Point Farm Hotel, and it was rumored, probably truthfully, that J.J. Wright had a substantial interest in the Crown and Anchor Hotel, where you could get a drink. But Joe Hess was a remarkable person who came here several times to Goderich and spoke. He drew huge crowds, had altar calls where dozens, maybe hundreds of people came up at the Opera House to be saved, which was right over there. And unfortunately, he kind of met with too much fighting, I think, because in his early 40s, he was sincere about his conversion. In his early 40s, he died, and he left his family in pretty good straits because he had a fairly decent living as a speaker. But he seemed to have died because of in the head, and it looks like almost like he took when he was younger, took way too many blows to the head. And reading his accounts of fights he'd been in, fights they thought that he was knocked out in, and he got back up and almost killed, and maybe did kill the other guy. They're brutal. And once again, the Victorians cheered that, right? They thought that, that was real entertainment, real manly entertainment. All right. Now, and then there is the dark side in Huron County. Laudanum, an opiate extract, highly addictive, goes from being a drug in the mid part of the Victorian Age that was positively beneficial. Newspaper advertisements or include that contains laudanum, so your child will sleep at night. And my favorite one, I can't find for this, but my favorite advertisement is all these angels blowing trumpets and saying we're selling laudanum. It was clearly selling some sort of opiate dream, right? But laudanum, all of a sudden, the addictive, in the Victorian Age, once again, the addictive properties of laudanum become more and more of a problem than their curative ones. The papers are rife with people ODing on laudanum. You could buy it over the counter, and Canada actually makes illegal in 1905 the making and distribution of laudanum, but it was a real problem, but it's hard to gauge just how much of a problem it was. But the papers are rife with people who committed suicide drinking laudanum. The chief constable of Goderich, John Ewell, he had an earache, and he must have drank, whether it was just to kill the pain or just a form of euthanasia or something like that. He was found in his apartment with several bottles of empty laudanum around him, but he was suffering from a terrible earache. So laudanum had some curative or some therapeutic value, but as the Victorian Age goes on, it becomes more and more of an addictive problem. In fact, before they ran in Edward Jardine, they ran in somebody else because they were a morphine laudanum addict, and they were renting at a hotel, and they thought he was capable of doing something terrible. Turned out he wasn't, and I don't know what happened to him. But laudanum was an opiate that, we have a drug problem now, but we had a drug problem 120 years ago or longer. maybe not as bad, but it's hard to know because you could buy it over the counter. Okay, and now we're getting the bridge between professional medical people and the old-fashioned medical, we'll call them quacks. The man on the right, Dr. J.M. McLeod, he had an elixir, very popular elixir that he sold for decades. Decades. He was so popular and considered so important to the Victorian Age in Ontario that Goderich put out a book in 1897 called A Souvenir of Goderich. And he is considered one of the half-dozen people that Goderich was noted for. He went to a legit medical school. He was a legit doctor, but his cure-all elixir for everything from private diseases to cancers to catarrhs to the egg to shakes, everything was this elixir that he used to make up. Somebody just sent me a message on Facebook about a week ago, bought me a bottle that had the label still on it of his elixir and its cure-all. I remember a couple of years ago, I was still teaching, and they had what he put in that elixir in one of the adverts. I took it into some science teachers at Central Huron, and the one woman said, "Well, this is poison. This is almost poison. This will almost kill you." But whatever it was, people wrote testimonials in the paper. Name people that you could check, double check, cross-reference on the census. Sent testimonials in the paper. I assume he asked them, and he gave them a free bottle or something about how it cured people. But whether it was, he probably didn't cure anybody with that elixir, but there might have been some psychological value. The other thing, before we go back, the other thing is, it was a science right up until this period was phrenology. People thought that they could tell your personality and your IQ by the bumps, reading the bumps on your skull, right up until the 1890s. School administrators were determining a student's placement by the bumps on their head. I mean, at the time it was a bogus science, but you wonder what we're peddling today that might be bogus. I don't know. Because there were some questionable educational theories over the last 30 years. But anyway. And the other thing is the bawdy houses in Huron. Believe it or not, it's not hard to find bawdy houses in any town in Huron County. Every town in Huron County that you look up, bawdy houses or houses of ill repute, had at least one. In the 1890s, Goderich had 3. The only one that doesn't is Exeter. I guess the people in Exeter are really good living. Either that, the paper just didn't cover them. And it might be because the one paper, there was a little village outside of Exeter called Sodom. And in the 19th century, why would the paper wouldn't carry its name? They couldn't get a Methodist minister that would minister to any town called Sodom. I just kind of thought it'd be a great backdrop to like a Ontario Gothic novel. They have a blind preacher that was a lay preacher. Anyway, it's not about Gotham, but the bawdy houses in Huron in the 1890s were pretty prolific. As said, Goderich in the 1890s had 3. Had Mrs. Carey's institution over near what's the hospital now. They had Mrs. Aggie Thomas's, which is, I figured out, is she had hers up by the railroads on Britannia Street. You know how Britannia Street kind of doglegs and goes up by the railroad? I think hers was on the railroad. And then there was Mrs. Hamilton's establishment. Mrs. Carey's, she didn't do the right thing. She didn't pay off local law enforcement. What it seems, how they operated, the madam would come in and she'd make contact with local law enforcement, buy them off, and sometimes, like I suspect in Goderich, she had the connivance of the mayor. The mayor at the time, Mayor Butler, John Butler, he ran a bookshop on the square. He was mayor. The trees on the square and the bullet were thanks to him. He's the first one that thought trees would beautify the square. And he was a practical person in the 1890s. Goderich had a lot of transient, mostly men. You get a lot of mariners. You get a lot of farm workers, salt workers. You get a lot more transient farm workers. You get a lot more transient people then. And he was a little bit more practical. It seems the rule was, like there's no rule book that I could find on how to run these, but it seems the rule was, keep it on the edge of town. Make sure that the local constable, he's going to be your bouncer. You got to pay him, and if there's any funny stuff, he's going to be the bouncer. And whatever you do, lay low and don't keep your mouth shut. Keep your little black book to yourself. And that seems to be how they operated in Goderich. Anyway, Mrs. Carey didn't follow those rules, and her house was destroyed. A mob set upon her house and tore it apart. And they used to call the constables then Butler's Rangers after Mayor Butler. They stood by and did nothing. Now, she did sue the town for negligence and not having their police help police or protect her property, and she got money. Another one I'll talk about in a second. So they did have some power. They did have some agency. The other one, as much as the local paper and the ministers tried to get rid of her, Mrs. Hamilton's establishment. She was probably the mistress. We don't even know what her real name was. She was probably the mistress of the Hamilton chief of police. She came here, opened up an establishment, and it was quite the going concern on the south edge of town. They couldn't move her. It was hard to get a conviction on these establishments because you'd have to have somebody go in there and exchange money for alcohol or money for sex. There weren't a lot of people willing to go to court doing that. Okay? And so it was really hard to kind of get at them. They kind of just shut, like Mrs. Hamilton just closed up on her own. Mrs. Thomas was run out of town because her protection, Constable Alfred Nicholson, was caught being drunk on duty. They suspected he was squiring people to the Mrs. Thomas's place. They caught him. He said, I'd been drinking but wasn't drunk, and he was dismissed from the service by the town council. Now, he dies a hero's death in 1910 on a burning barge down in the St. Clair River. He jumped aboard and saved the family of 6 by getting them off the barge and rowing them to shore. But he himself lost his life in the struggle. But anyway, he was probably or maybe undoubtedly in with Mrs. Thomas. Mrs. Thomas, though, wasn't happy about leaving. She defiantly threatened to leave her client list or whatever she called it at the time behind. And they drove her out on the train, said, you got to get out on the train. Well, before the train, she drove at a defiant couple laps around the square. She ran her buckboard and wagon around the square, shaking her fist in the air, basically, before she got on the train and left for Seaforth. And then she was driven out of Seaforth. Seaforth had its problems with its houses of ill repute because the madam there in 1869 tried to burn the town down. She almost succeeded. Mrs. Griffith, by day, ran a candy store. At night, she ran a bordello up above. And she was, for whatever reason, she was not happy with her living arrangements, and she threatened to burn her candy store down. 2 nights later, fire destroys, guts the downtown of Seaforth. It was only salt that saved Seaforth. They got the idea that when the water ran out, all these salt barrels down by the railroad track, they ran up and they poured salt on the fire, and the wind changed direction, and the fire went out, but I can't remember how many acres of downtown Seaforth were destroyed. Mrs. Griffith was charged with arson, and her lawyer brilliantly argued in court that there's nothing in British common law that says you can't burn down your own property. She should have been charged with burning down other people's property. So it was a real quick, because they didn't want these people around talking a lot, right? So it was a real quick, case dismissed, and she disappears into history. Okay. And there was one, I think it was Molly Moore from Wingham. Once again, a mob beset her house, and she went to the Justice of the Peace, and she got a judgment against those people that destroyed her property, and I think she got money. I think just like Mrs. Carey, they got money. Of course, so they did you couldn't just walk all over them, right? But it was, as I said, it was one of the darker sides of the Victorian age. But a lot of women, there's no health care. If your husband dies or takes off, there's, not a lot of career options out there. Okay, well, the Gothic Age ends, of course. We say it ends with the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. And that's usually right. I'd say it goes on almost to the end of World War II, or World War I, World War I. When you get that, I mean, sadly, the First World War, the Gothic Age probably in some part created the mindset for the First World War, where death was so noble. Young death and honorable death was so noble. And tens of thousands, as we know, of Canadians sacrificed themselves. And then the last act of the Gothic Age, I would say, would be the expressions. Now I'm advertising my next book, but the expressions of public art and public mourning through our cenotaphs. Cenotaph means, it's the ancient Greek for empty tomb. And the cenotaph, every town in Huron County had its own discussion, had its own emotional discussion on how best to commemorate their dead. And every town came to a different decision. Okay? And some, like Clinton, took until 1966 to come up with a decision. And then you get places like Blythe, where Blythe Memorial Hall is their cenotaph. And when they had the cenotaph unveilings, because in the British Commonwealth at the time, soldiers were buried near the battlefield that they fought at, and these were surrogate funerals for people that they had known that were taken from the community, basically. And every single cenotaph service unveiling gathers like an entire villages come out. Can you imagine at St. Helens when they had their cenotaph unveiling? Mr. John Joint was so moved by the sacrifice of so many. He didn't have sons, he had daughters, and he was well above military age. He was a wealthy grain merchant. He paid for the St. Helens cenotaph, and when they unveiled it on the May 2-4 weekend, 1920, can you imagine 15,000 people around St. Helens to come to watch a cenotaph unveil? If you don't know the area, St. Helens now consists of a community hall and about 3 houses. It's just a crossroads. But anyway, that's when I would say the Gothic Age really ends, and it puts people in a different mindset or mind. And the only thing I'll say, that's Trivet is neat because it's the only place in Huron County that has a carillon, a natural carillon with 10 bells. The big bell weighs over a ton and is named Big Tom. And that's the bell that pealed out or rang out or tolled for the death of Queen Victoria in January 1901, which put Huron County into deep mourning for a long time. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Great job. How does he keep all that stuff in his mind? Isn't that amazing? We're going to ask if there's any questions, but I have one first. Do you know what the Bawdy houses? What were they charging?
I know you might be able to get a grant from town council.
Oh yeah, we're up to town council.
Find out.
Does anybody have any questions for Mr. Yates before we let him go?
Yeah, I know. If I knew the answer,
what do you pay? Anyone? Great, Mr. Yates. Thank you very much for your kind attention here today, and for you guys for being here. There are some books for sale back there, and they're really good. Dave does an amazing job. You can see why he was such a wonderful teacher. Favorite of my daughters, for sure. Absolutely. Thank you very much, everybody, and have a great rest of the afternoon. Pleasure.
Thank you.